Hello everyone, welcome back to another video. I am Mr. Rishi and today I'm going to be giving you a complete guide on how to build your very own competitive Tem team. Before we get into things, I would like to give a huge shout out to everyone who helped out on this video, who I will be linking in the description, and to Rig for writing up the initial document that this guide is based off of, which I will also be linking in the description. With that done and out of the way, let's get right into things. To start, let's make sure that you know the basics. You should already have an understanding of SVs and TVs. If you do not, then make sure to check out my Tem Basics guide, which will be linked in the description. And if there are any techniques or Tems that are mentioned in this guide that you do not know about, make sure to head over to the Tem wiki and look them up. I will say that to get the most out of this guide, you should have a general sense of what each Tem does, or at least what most Tems in the metagame want to do. Some quick tips when analyzing different Tem are to look at their base stats, traits, and moveset. A bad stat is 45-ish, a middling stat is 55 to 60, a respectable/good stat are found in the 60s to 70s, and a good to great stat is 70s plus. There are exceptions. A base stamina stat of 60 is good depending on how expensive their moveset is. Keep in mind that good speeds depend on the Tem's access to good priority moves. Make sure to keep these points in mind when reading through Toward Knight's Garden or the wiki. Some other ways to get a better understanding of the meta and what each Tem in it does is to watch recent tourney videos on Twitch or YouTube. Here you can watch players go through the pick ban process and look at which Tems they are using. I would also consider copying a team from a successful player, as then you know that the team works, thus when you lose a game, you can look at what you need to improve on rather than being worried about how the team can be improved, thus helping you learn the metagame and the game in general quicker. As a side note, this guide will be written and released before Tem Showdown comes out. Although when it does come out, there should be videos on my channel that show off teams and allow others to copy them. You are going to also want to familiarize yourself with the Tem team damage calculator and team build, which will be addressed in part 2. I will be linking all these resources in the description below. Okay, now assuming that you've done your homework and have a basic understanding of things I talked about, let us get into the guide. First thing that you need to understand is that most of the Tems in Tem can be placed on a variety of teams and therefore many different places on the graph shown here. As an example, Banshee can be placed in aggro control and hyper aggro, but is not limited to these types of teams. This is because its placement depends on its spreads, teammates, and even moveset. And as a side note, if you hear someone talking about mid-range, it usually means somewhere between immortal and die fast. Keep in mind, the info in this guide is a starting point to show you the fundamentals. It is not the quote-unquote laws of Tem team building. Now let's get into the team building. First, you are going to want to pick 3 to 4 Tems that you believe complement each other nicely. In this document, Tems that work together are said to complement one another. We mean Tems that work well because of the synergy system, are strong versus the Tems that threaten the rest of your core or team, or enable a strategy. These 3 to 4 Tems will form the core of your team. For example, a great way to start building a core is to identify a strong synergy move such as Hellfire. The Hellfire synergy significantly boosts its power, burns the enemy, and increases the priority, which might even allow you to move before your opponents and reduce the damage of their attacks on the same turn. Hellfire is only given to Fire Tems, and to gain the synergy, it relies on having an ally Fire Tem on the board. In order to cover the water and earth weaknesses of these Fire Tems, you might consider adding Nature Tems. To categorize this core, it falls under the cores built around synergies category, as it revolves around Synergy Hellfire. Another example of how Tems can complement each other is via a more traditional support carry dynamic. Supports like Kinu can protect and heal allies that have much more base stats and powerful moves than it. These are usually called raid bosses. Support Tems can also be offensive in nature, such as Scunch, who can land a defense-lowering perfect jab to boost an extremely hard-hitting move from a physical attacker. If Scunch's ally threatens a target for ×1 or ×2 damage, that allows Scunch to live under less pressure. Thus, it lives longer and gets more attacks off. Now that we have completed the core of your team, let us take a look at the type chart of it. A great rule of thumb is to try to balance your resistances and weaknesses roughly even between the two. This allows you to have ample swap-ins if the board is in an unfavorable state for you. Once you get a hang of team building, looking at the coverage chart may also be useful, but because of how complex the subject is, we will not be covering that in today's video. Now that you're aware of that rule of thumb, your next 2 to 3 slots on your team are going to most likely be dedicated to shoring up the weaknesses of your core and the rest of your team. There are always exceptions to this soft rule that may be more meta, trait, or move dependent. Again, this is not a hard rule or something to be followed strictly, just a rule of thumb that usually works. Now in our next step, step 3, we will be going over dealing with the meta. The first 3 to 4 Tems should form your core. The next 2 to 3 should shore up your type chart. Any leftover space should be devoted to dealing with meta threats while still keeping the type chart in mind, obviously. To do this, you must know what the meta is, which is a little easier said than done. The YouTube videos and Twitch streams and VODs that I mentioned in the introduction can be very useful to see what Tems are commonly used at a given time. Hashtag competitive questions in the official Temtem Discord can also be a useful place to ask around. Now that you have a basic understanding of the meta, take a look at your team and ask yourself, can my team deal with X Tem or Y strategy? And if you don't know if you can deal with a certain Tem strategy, that is totally fine. Team building is not a one and done process. It might take switching a slot in your team a couple of times to be able to deal with said meta threats. This will be spoken about in more detail in part 3. Moving on to the next step, we will be discussing a little bit about thinking of pick and ban phase during team building. Does one ban render your team especially weak to something? If they ban your only nature, can you handle a water heavy team? That's what is referred to as getting banned out. There are 2 ways of approaching this concept. You can either have a must ban Tem, where you permanently ban a certain Temtem while being able to handle everything else in the meta somewhat. Or, on the other hand, you can take it game by game and try to analyze which Tem on the enemy team threatens your Tem the most. This second option is much harder, but can be better in some matchups. These are not the only 2 ways to think about pick ban when building a team. These are just 2 of the main examples that may help you on your team building journey. In this step, step 5, we will be talking about finding good partners for the Tems on your team. A good tip to follow when building a team is to not mishmash unrelated cores together. Although this rule can definitely be broken, it's probably best to follow it as a starting point. Another general tip to follow is that you want Tems to be of similar pace when you are finding teammates for one another. Pace is a term that is used to describe the speed at which Tems play and progress the game. For example, Malflink is a high-paced Tem that can deal a lot of damage quickly, while Benefactor Kinu is a lower-paced Tem that slows down the pace gain of your opponent through decreasing the net damage they do. So, based on what I mentioned back in step 1, Scunch's best allies would be similarly fast speed-wise and heavy damage dealing Tems. Usually, they are just below Scunch's speed, and of course they must be physically attacking. Again, this is just a general tip. You by no means have to follow this. Just advised to when starting out. Now that we have our Tems in our team, make sure to go back through your team and check for unique threats to it. Some teams will greatly struggle with a specific Tem and may have to ban it on site. You want to try to avoid having more than one Tem that you must ban, as that can get you in some trouble when they are both on the same team. If the two Tems that you must ban are not usually on the same team most of the time, then you should be fine with going through with the team. An example of this may be having to ban both Cycrox and Chromion, where Cycrox is usually on slower teams and Chromion is usually on faster teams. On to our last step of part 1. This is a pretty simple yet important step. You're going to want to make sure to put gears on your Temtem when building your team. The best place to go for useful gear info and placement are the previously mentioned Tortonite's Garden or #competitive questions in the official Temtem Discord. And that is all for part 1 of this guide. If it helped you out at all, make sure to sub and like, as it helps me grow and goes a long way. Make sure to keep an eye out for part 2 and part 3, as they should already be out. And I'll see you guys in the next parts. Peace.